Hi everyone, I'm Dre. On today's video, I thought we could talk about how we could leverage the Kanban framework to improve some operational activities or process paths that we follow on a regular basis. So to get us started, we'll take a look at what some of the basics of the Kanban framework are, and then we'll see how we can apply those in health IT. The general principles behind Kanban really got started back in the 1940s when Toyota, the car manufacturer, was looking into making some improvements in their production line. So they were trying to apply some lean processes so that they could have their production become more efficient and have less waste overall. So with this effort, there were 6 rules that Toyota followed that helped them to hone their production process over time to make it as effective as it is today. So in 1988, these 6 rules were published in a book called the Toyota Production System Beyond Large-Scale Productions. And the individual that authored that book, whose name I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, is Tahichi Ono. So the 6 rules that were documented were that each process issues requests or Kanban to its suppliers when it consumes its supplies. Each process produces according to the quantity and sequence of incoming requests. No items are made or transported without a request. The request associated with an item is always attached to it. Processes must not send out defective items to ensure the finished products will be defect-free, and limiting the number of pending requests makes the process more sensitive and reveals inefficiencies. So fast forward from 1988 to the early 2000s, and a Microsoft engineer by the name of David J. Anderson really looked into expanding these rules and making them applicable across multiple industries and across areas that actually weren't just focused on the production of tangible goods. So Anderson started applying the enhanced framework that he was working on to projects beginning in 2004, and he continued to do that for several years. And then in 2010, he actually published his work in a book called Kanban, which really talked about how the framework should be applied and how it related back to those 6 production steps or 6 production rules that Toyota had put in place with their production system. So there are 4 underlying concepts that are present when applying the Kanban framework to a project or to a process flow. So the first one is that you should start with the current process. So understanding how things are currently done and what the process flow step by step is start to finish of the event needs to be where everything is taken from. The second underlying principle is that the team that's working on applying the Kanban framework needs to all agree that there's going to be incremental change that occurs over time. The purpose of Kanban is not to take a look at a process flow or to look at a pathway and then do dramatic changes very quickly. It's actually to repeat that pathway multiple times and do small, very deliberate, very intentional incremental change so that you do over time get to a much more efficient and effective process with much less waste. The third is that the current policies, roles, and responsibilities also need to be taken into consideration. So just as you documented and are starting with the current process from a step-by-step perspective, you also want to start the Kanban process when it comes to a workflow by utilizing existing policies and the roles and responsibilities that are applied to each individual in the steps so that you can understand where those little tweaks and incremental changes need to be made. The fourth and final principle that sort of underlines the entire thing is that leadership should be encouraged at all levels. And this one came about a little bit later, so you may come across some Kanban framework documentation that leaves this one out, as well as some that has this be more of a focal point. But really encouraging leadership at all levels helps with that buy-in and helps with the entire change mentality and change mindset that's going to go along with applying those incremental changes. So to consider how the process is put in place and to take a look at an example in healthcare IT, we'll take a look at a Kanban board, which is a very integral part of the entire framework, by using the example of adding a new order item to a catalog. So we've taken a fairly consistent, fairly typical operational change activity that is going to be repeated over and over. We can look at it just from the context of one order category, or we can look at it in a broad sense overall. But we're going to take a look at the request all the way through to the deployment or passing of change control for that order item each time we have a new one that comes through. And we'll follow the steps that it's going to take to get from start to finish by using a Kanban board and columns that are going to represent each of the key milestone stages along the way. So the first column in the example is going to be prioritized requests. This is where all of the requests for new items are going to come, and they're going to wait until there's space to move forward. So the next column is our requirements, followed by our build, followed by testing, which I've divided into unit, functional, and integrated, and then followed by change control. So the way that the application of the Kanban board really works is that you are going to take this sequence of events and we're going to make sure that we understand what actions, steps, and time needs to take place within each of the columns. So we need to make sure that what's entering the flow is actually going to be able to exit the flow, ideally at a predictable time. So we're going to have quite a few things in that request column, and there is likely going to be things that are being asked from end users that don't even make it onto that column. So I'm not going to touch on that part right now. We'll use a different process to sort of focus on that part. So what we're really talking about here is request items that are okay to go forward. So these aren't just any and every idea that comes to mind. These are the ones that have been triaged, if you will. So before they can go on to the next step, you need to make sure that the individuals that are working on the next step have the capacity and the ability to deal with it. So they're going to call back and say, I'm ready for the next one. And that's going to happen throughout all of the columns. So as each piece of work is done within a column, you're not going to push the work forward to the next column. With Kanban, what really happens is the future column, or the one that's to the right, is going to say, okay, I'm ready, and they're going to request their next piece of activity so that you can make sure that they're only taking what they can handle, and you can really find where any of those bottlenecks are going to occur. So you want to make sure that as you move forward, you're not producing more than can be accepted by the next column, if you will. So that's one of the things that's actually going to highlight itself very quickly, is it's going to tell you along the process where you're bottling things up. So you'll be able to see where you can apply more resources, where you can perhaps take a look at improving your processes, what sort of tweaks you can make. But that pull forward is really one of the key components of Kanban. It's not a push until we get to the end. So another key element that you need to consider is that you don't want to push defective work forward. So you do need to make sure that something is completed, that it's been agreed to, signed off on, everything looks great before it is actually sent over to the next step. If you start to push things forward that are not quite done or aren't quite meeting the expectations that the group has or the definition of done that they've set, all you're going to do if you continue to sort of allow it to go forward in the process is you have an opportunity to magnify those defects or magnify those errors so that the end result isn't exactly what the end users are looking for, or so that you've got something at the end that doesn't meet what your requirements had at the beginning. So that's something just to apply throughout the whole process. That really should be applied to everything we do. We don't ever want to move something forward that hasn't been fully developed, fully signed off on. We want to minimize the risk of compounding any defects that we have. As you process things through a Kanban framework, you're actually going to utilize a board such as this. So a lot of people use actual whiteboards with sticky notes to go through the process, and they move the sticky from one spot to the other. You're going to look at this over a period of time, so it's not going to be a one-time event. It is most helpful in healthcare IT to actually have this process done for something fairly granular. So you don't want to take every new order item, for example, that ever comes into your department for the year and try to run it through Kanban. You're going to have a board on the wall that's just astronomical in size. You want to try to manage the process and manage, incrementally pieces of it. There are certainly some programs that you can utilize. So Trello and Asana are two of the more common ones that are utilized to sort of flow through this type of process. So they have, instances where you have the column and a block of color, if you will, that you can move through the process. So you can do something that way, or you can actually do it with sticky notes on the wall or with lines on the whiteboard. As you go through the process, one of the other things that's very important when you're applying a Kanban framework to an operational flow is you want to make sure that everything is being documented along the way. If you do find a bottleneck, if you do find some sort of process that's inefficient, if you do find that capacity is limited in some place, or that perhaps you have an opportunity to tweak some roles and responsibilities or apply a policy that would help with the flow and help minimize waste or some of that trouble spot that you'll come across, you want to make sure those are always documented along the way, and that you're updating your standard operating procedures, or you're updating all of the documentation that sort of flows through the path. In order for the Kanban framework to be most effective, it's also really important on top of that documentation that you're actually articulating to everyone that's involved that the process is taking place and that there's a strong and well socialized understanding of why it's taking place and what's actually occurring. The transparency that comes forward with telling everyone just helps them understand if there's changes that are going to be made, and especially if there's changes that are made to policies as something flows through. So another example of where Kanban could be applied would be in user provisioning. So we have a fairly consistent process that should be well documented, does have very clear roles and responsibilities, and does have policies applied in the provisioning of new users or the deprovisioning of users for applications. If you're looking to make that process flow a little more efficient and a little less wasteful, Kanban is a great tool that can be applied to that as well. Applying the framework overall does add a little bit of overhead with maintaining that board, and it is helpful to have one person sort of overseeing what that looks like, similar to how you'd have someone managing an old school whiteboard triage for an emergency department. So you may have several different people that are keeping track and assisting with migrating things through the paths or through the columns, but you do want to make sure somebody's got an eye on the overall to make sure that things are going appropriately and make sure that those bottlenecks are really being spotted. So that's just a quick example of how we can apply the Kanban framework to operational processes in the health IT space. It can certainly be applied in many other areas, and some people even choose to apply it to things like sprints within projects if they're following a Scrum type framework. But in general, I think it's best applied to operational process. I do think that it has the ability to help quite a bit if we look at it in this purposeful and intentional way. So if you are interested in learning more about Kanban, the Agile Institute and the Project Management Institute have quite a bit of information on it, as well as some courses that you can take. So I'll put the 2 links to those below. I hope that you found today's video helpful, and I will see you again soon.